Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. I want to welcome you to today's Chamber event and hope that you're doing so feeling safe and secure in this moment, just what we needed. A hurricane tearing up the East Coast in the middle of all of the other crises we're dealing with. As a region, many of us have gone through a tremendous time of uncertainty and change as we deal with the effects of this COVID-19 crisis. And really that period of uncertainty, when you think about it, will last until there is widespread testing, effective treatment, or the ultimate, which is a vaccine. But no one is predicting any of that to happen, especially a vaccine this year. So we're going to be faced with that uncertainty for at least the rest of this year and probably into next year and in some ways beyond. We all want to get our lives back. We know it's not going to be the old normal. It'll be some form of new normal. But what does that mean? And how do we deal with it in the meantime? Today's discussion fits into that, and it's about the reopening of our schools. I know it's an issue on a lot of people's minds. It's certainly on the minds of my household as we think about the children in our broader family and how they're going to deal with that. Some might ask why the business community, and the answer is two words: working parents. As we think about reopening businesses, certainly on the minds of employees, issues like childcare and return to school. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. This is part of a Future of Boston series that the Chamber has been executing during this COVID crisis to talk about a wide variety of issues, so thank you for joining us. We have 600 people joining on today's event, so I'm so glad to see that number. If you want to ask a question during the program, do so by utilizing the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. This program is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube page after the presentation. And with that, I'd like to give a big thank you to our sponsor for today's program and this series of programs, a real leader in the Greater Boston business community, MFS Investments. Thanks to their generous support, these discussions in this series are possible. I'll now pass it over to Kim Hyland, Managing Director, Head of U.S. Relationship Management Team at MFS, to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Jim, and it really is my pleasure to be here. MFS is thrilled to be a sponsor of today's event. As a Massachusetts-based company, we want to do our part for the schools in Massachusetts, and we all know how important school is for the emotional and physical well-being of our students. So MFS is here to support and do our part while keeping our students and teachers safe. So on behalf of MFS Investment Management, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speakers. We've got a great lineup. I just want to start by thanking our interpreters for today's program, both Wendy and Sana. They're from the Mass Commission of Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So thank you to Wendy and Sana. So now to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Jeff Riley, Commissioner of Education for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Jeff's experience spans urban and suburban districts, including teaching in Baltimore, Maryland, being principal of Tingsboro Middle School and Boston's Edwards Middle School, as well as the superintendent of Lawrence Public Schools. Next, we have Brenda Casilius, Superintendent for Boston Public Schools. With more than 3 decades as an educator, Dr. Casilius has held a variety of roles, including Commissioner of Education in Minnesota, Superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools District, and Academic Superintendent of Middle School in Memphis, Tennessee. Up next, we have Dr. Ingrid Tucker, Head of School for the Cambridge Montessori School. Dr. Tucker's experience in independent schools began in 1993 and has since included a variety of roles such as Dean of Multicultural Affairs, President of Mother Caroline Academy and Education Center in Dorchester, Middle School Director, Assistant Head of School in Chestnut Hill, and Director of Admissions at the Atrium School. Our next panelist is Dr. Patrick Tutwiler, Superintendent of Lynn Public Schools. Dr. Tutwiler joined Lynn Public Schools in 2015 and has also held a variety of positions in the educational world, including headmaster at Brighton High School in Boston, principal of Wayland High School, dean of students at Westford Academy, and assistant headmaster at English High School in Boston. And then last, but certainly not least, we have today's moderator for the second part of the program, and that's Marta McAllister, program manager at Google for Education. And Marta is a former teacher turned Googler who drives the voice of educators in product and program development and has done this for the past 9 years. Outside of work, Marta is involved in various boards where she influences education policy and programs such as teacher compensation and digital equity. So wow, what a great group we have today with us. And I want to say thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us. And Jim, I'm going to turn it back over to you for part one of the program.
You're on mute.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you again to MFS for your support of the program. As Kim said, we're going to do this in two parts. We're going to start with a presentation and conversation with Commissioner Jeff Riley, and then we'll go to our panel discussion. Welcome, Commissioner Riley.
Thanks for having me today, Jim.
Thanks for being here. So we're going to do this. I know you have a presentation on the framework of the reopening guidance plan that your team has put together. So why don't I turn it over to you to do that, and then we'll have a conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll just try to go through it quickly to give people an overview so they know kind of the state and where we're at. Next slide, please. So all of our decisions when we think about how to get school up and running again are really based on the medical professionals, the medical community, and what they're telling us what to do, coupled with kind of our return to school working group, which is made up of everyone from students, teachers, parents, school administrators, and other stakeholders in education. In particular, we've relied heavily on Dr. Sandra Nelson, who's an infectious disease specialist at MGH. She's also consulting with 2 of the 4 professional sports teams on their opening. The governor's COVID Command Center, which is made up of doctors and medical professionals. And then Lloyd Fisher, who's the president of the Massachusetts chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. He represents over 2,000 pediatricians in Massachusetts, and their advice is that students should be going back to school this fall based on the data and what they believe is best for kids. And it's not just these folks that feel that way. I think those of you that follow Johns Hopkins, they've been doing a lot on reopening, and they've identified us as one of the 17 states, I believe, that they consider to be ready to start the process of reopening in person. Now, the reality, though, is that school is not going to look the same as it always has. Next slide, please. We know that there's going to have to be additional protocols put in place so that kids and teachers can be safe. And so when we think about what the models can look like for school this year, we really think about 3 models, and we exclude one model to the left. And the model to the left is this idea of returning without restrictions, as if it was a pre-pandemic era. And we can only get to that green box if and when a vaccine is developed and it's distributed and it has a high effectiveness rate. And obviously we're hoping for that. I think we all are hoping for that. But I think the best case scenario is that that would be maybe available at the beginning of the year, but who knows? And we've got to wait. And so in the meantime, we've asked districts to plan for 3 models. And the reason we did that is because we wanted them to be prepared for all contingencies. We don't exactly know what the budget situation is going to look like right now. Beacon Hill did say recently that they're going to try to level fund us, which is great. But we don't know, for instance, if there's going to be a 4th stimulus package from the federal government. We also don't know what the trajectory of the virus is. We know that our transmission rates right now are really low, but we know that there could be a second spike some point later in the year. And as such, we need to be ready for all possibilities. And so we've asked superintendents to plan for these 3 models. One would be this idea of in-person learning with all students, but you'd have to meet certain safety requirements. And those include physical distancing. Kids would have to be spread out between 3 and 6 feet. Kids would have to wear masks. Kids would have to do frequent hand washing or hand sanitizing. And districts would have to figure out all the protocols for having kids come into school and exit school and passing and lunch and whatnot. And so that is one model that some districts are considering. Another model is on the far right-hand side, which is this idea of remote learning. The idea is if there's a second spike, or if there's a community that feels that they have been particularly impacted by the virus, they might want to start opening their schools up remotely. And that is this idea that kids would be learning from home with technology for the most part, although we certainly do not discourage project-based learning or even packets if they're of high quality. But the idea that districts need to be ready in case that that decision is made either now or later. And then the third model is this idea of hybrid learning, which is a mix of in-person instruction and remote instruction. The idea that kids might be home several days a week, and they might be, another half of the kids might be learning remotely, and then they might switch. And so the idea would be to kind of reduce class sizes to meet the medical conditions. And we ask districts to be ready for all of these things because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And we need to be ready to pivot maybe between or among these models, depending on the circumstances. We are hearing that most vast majority of the superintendents are interested in either a hybrid or in-person model based, I think, on the best medical advice. We see the New England states are opening up. We have in New England some of the lowest transmission rates, as does New York and a few other places. So we see other school districts across the region are opening, and we think that most superintendents are preferring the in-person model or the hybrid model. There may be, however, some districts that prefer the remote model if they've been hit particularly hard by the virus. At the end of the day, though, it's not the superintendents who will decide. In Massachusetts, which believes in local control, it's the school committees that will make those decisions. And so that is where the final decisions will rest, is on the school committees. We at the state are recommending to try to get kids back in person as much as possible. So that really means the hybrid model or the in-person model. But ultimately, it will be the school committee who's making the decision. Next slide, please. So again, what we're trying to do is get as many kids back in person as possible. Even in a hybrid model where maybe the kids only come in half the time, we have asked districts to consider bringing in special needs students and other vulnerable students full-time. We've heard from many special education parents of complex kids that their children have regressed without being in school, without getting the services they need. And so we've asked districts to consider bringing those students back full-time, even if they're in a hybrid model, if possible. You know, everything we've done has been based on the medical literature and what the doctors are telling us. People, I think, have seen the New England Journal of Medicine. I think people have seen the articles that the doctors are saying, we want to get the schools open and now is the time to do that. And at the end of the day, we've got to, though, make sure that we use these suite of services, the masking, the hand washing, the distancing, to make sure that we keep our students and staff as safe as possible. Next slide, please. And so the one that's not, that I didn't discuss, is this idea that we're asking parents to keep their kids home if they're sick, and teachers as well. And this is different from something we've ever done in education, right? There's always been a real push to make sure that school is mandatory and children show up. This is going to be one of the rare times in education in the country and in the state where we say, we really want you to be overly cautious. And if you do think you're sick, parents should keep their kids home. Next slide, please. So we asked districts to put together these 3 plans, and they just submitted them this past Friday. We have teams of people at the department reviewing them to offer them guidance. And then we're going to get that guidance back to them later this week so that school committees can vote for their final decision for what they're going to open with shortly thereafter. There's been a couple of people that have kind of jumped the gun and made decisions early, which is too bad because I think we're trying to wait to get as much information as possible. I think making a decision in mid-July would be a mistake. I recognize that parents need to know. So we think that kind of the August 10th deadline for a final submission, some districts have asked for a few extra days, but to give the school committee time to decide what the best plan is and then get the information out to parents is the way to go. And that is in process right now. And again, we'll be getting the feedback on the plans to districts back this week, and then school committee will vote shortly thereafter, most of them. Last slide, please. It's the last slide. So in the interim, we put out numerous guidance policy documents regarding calendar decisions. I think people have seen that I worked with the teachers unions and I came off the 180-day requirement because I really felt that teachers were going to need time to plan in this new kind of educational world they're entering into. Remember, no matter which of the three plans that people choose, all of them are going to be different than typical education has been, for the last several decades. So we felt like instead of having a 180-day calendar for students, having 170 days and using those 10 days to provide additional time for students, for staff, students, and principals to kind of learn the ropes and get the information out is going to be critical. We've also put out guidance around special education. Perhaps the most important guidance we put out is stop-start guidance, which is what do you do if you have a sick student that's suspected of having COVID-19 or a teacher? What is the protocol that is in place to handle that? So we put all that information out in a pretty detailed guidance document to schools so they kind of understand what the best practices are based on the medical professionals' advice on how to handle cases that may come up. And, I do think that we may have some cases that will come up, and it's just a question of how we manage those and how we deal with them appropriately and swiftly. Transportation guidance has been put out. Facilities and operation guidance has been put out where, we press upon the districts to follow the federal and state laws and guidelines around facilities and what that looks like. The one that has not come out that is probably on many people's minds is athletics and extracurricular activities. And we hope to have there's a working group with the MIAA, other folks, DESE, and other people are working on that to figure out will sports happen in our schools this year and what will be the restrictions for that. We know that the other New England states are having high school athletics. Some of them are modifying them. What I would say now is if we do choose to have them, there might be some modifications to them, but final word on that won't come out until next week. And that's kind of the overall situation for where districts are at and what we're trying to do, Jim. And I don't know if we want to turn it back to you for questions.
Yeah, so thank you for that overview of, I know what is a lot of information. We've already got more than 25 questions in the queue here, and I'll do my best to kind of summarize them and group them. But let's start with the process. Couple of questions on your mentioning of who was involved in the reopening group that you assembled. We're blessed here in Massachusetts to have the medical expertise that you referred to. But some questions about who else was involved: teachers, parents. I mean, was it wider than that? And can you expand on that process?
Yeah, so our working group met numerous times over several months. We had students, parents, teachers, union presidents were all on. We had doctors. We had consultants from the medical field. We had stakeholders from like the Boston Private Industry Council. We had transportation people. We had nurses. We just had a wide swath of people who are stakeholders in education who we felt could give us kind of the best possible recommendations as we made our guidance documents for how to think about opening schools in Massachusetts.
Great. I know you mentioned this, that ultimately the school committees, superintendents, and local elected officials will make the ultimate decisions. But could you expand on that in terms of process? You received the reopening plans. You're going to give feedback on those. We saw on the business side, and this comes from that kind of mindset, the governor had his reopening plans, restricted things and said, okay, these businesses can reopen. Some chose not to. Some cities decided we're going to do it a little bit differently. Somerville, Boston, for example. You know, what's the degree of guidance? What's the degree of control between the state and the school districts?
Yeah, in Massachusetts, we've always been a local control state. And so what I would say is that does not cancel out the state's obligation to put forth guidance or set specific policies. I'll give you an example. We in Massachusetts, by law, have to give the MCAS test. And so the state, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education administers that, and we put out the standards for what kids need to know. But we do not tell districts what they should teach, when they should teach it. We let them pick their own curriculum. We just say, we're giving you this test. This is what's going to be on it. These may be some documents that we recommend, some curriculum that we recommend, but districts have the flexibility to choose what they want to do. And so much like that, in this case, we're saying that we think the evidence says that people should open, but we also, what we're demanding is that you prepare for all three contingencies, because we just don't know what the trajectory of the virus is, right? Our numbers are low in New England and New York and a few other places. We're glad Johns Hopkins and the World Health Organization and other people say that our transmission rates are so low that we should be opening. But there's no guarantee that we won't have a spike over the 5% level that the WHO recommends, you know, sometime later in the fall. And so what we are saying to districts is they have to be prepared for all contingencies. The other thing we're saying that are kind of non-negotiables is the safety guidelines, which is the masking, the hand sanitizer, the distancing. Those are non-negotiable items that we say have to be part of the educational experience if you're going to go back in either hybrid or the in-person model. You know, there is this idea of local control, and people need to decide what they think is best for their communities, and we respect that.
All right. So you mentioned some of the requirements, some questions in the queue talk about expenses associated with those. Jeff, you're probably as positioned as anyone in the Commonwealth to answer this question in terms of, you know, financial and wealth disparities between school districts. Some of the, you know, more wealthy cities and towns that are able to support their school districts better might be better positioned. How do we ensure that those in low-income communities can meet not just the minimum standards, but give parents a level of comfort that their school district or their school is safe? And are there financial resources available from the state or the federal government to help with these supplies?
Yeah, there are. It's such a great question and a critical one. I think, you know, a lot of my previous experience has been in districts that didn't necessarily have the appropriate funding that they needed. My last stop being Lawrence, which was deemed to be, you know, fairly underfunded, which is why the Student Opportunity Act came up, and people recognized that the formula that was made 25 years ago had gone off kilter, and that some poorer communities were being shortchanged the money they deserved. And so when this pandemic hit and we put out our first reopening guidance, we were very clear that we believed that the cost of doing reopening is going to be more than level service. It's going to be more than what districts have now. It's going to be level service plus. And when we say plus, we mean we need additional dollars to pay for things like staffing, to pay for things like technology, to pay for things like safety supplies. There's going to be an additional cost. But more than that, we said we also have to focus on our historically under-resourced or underfunded school districts and make sure they're taken care of. Listen, we're grateful that it looks like Beacon Hill is going to level service our budget. But what I've said is it's going to take more money than that. And what we do know is so far, the federal government has given us $194 million in CARES Act money on top of what we'll get from Beacon Hill. In addition, the governor just announced another $200 million. And we're hoping that a fourth stimulus package from the federal government will come out in the next couple of weeks, which will really guarantee that districts will have the funding they need. Right now, districts have a pretty significant amount of money if they want to go back in person, all districts. But I think we recognize there may be things that come up later in the year. There may be more needs that we need. And so we really are relying on that fourth federal stimulus package, which we hope will come through.
What about on the student side, Jeff? There's a question in the queue about, to do remote or hybrid learning, you need access to the internet, you need, a computer. Is there assistance of it? Maybe this is a question for the superintendents, but, are there funds and assistance available on that side?
So that $194 million and the more recent $200 million can be used to buy those things. We know that districts put in orders for technology, for instance, as early as May and June for technology orders to make sure that their kids have what they need. And so there is certainly money available to the districts right now to place the orders for safety supplies, for technology and the like.
Great. Jeff, you mentioned you're following what's going on around the country through Johns Hopkins and others. Question in the queue about the bad experience down in Georgia with reopening. That's something that parents see on the news every day, and it creates a level of apprehension. As you look around school districts and schools in other countries and around the country, what are you looking at? What kinds of lessons are you picking up from the way that things have gone in other places?
Yeah, I think we've seen some schools in Europe that have opened and done a pretty good job of staying open and managing the COVID virus. That's not to say that there haven't been cases. There have been, but they put protocols in place on how to deal with those, which I think we've looked at as the doctors help us build our guidance for dealing with the potential for positive cases, whether it's a student or a teacher. We've got those things in place. But we also have to be prepared for the possibility of a second spike later sometime in the year. And we just don't know, right? I mean, maybe that won't happen, maybe it will. And so that's why we've asked districts to be prepared for all three. What we are saying is at this time, we think it's important, and what the doctors are very clear about is all of the negative effects that come of kids not being in school are much worse at this time, particularly given the data we have that says our transmission is low. We're seeing suicidal ideation, depression. We're seeing food scarcity issues with kids don't have food. We're seeing domestic abuse issues. I mean, there's just a lot of issues that are coming up when kids don't have that safe place to be and what they and the services they need. We're seeing the special education student regression as well as our own students. I don't think there's anyone that believes that remote instruction is comparable to in-person instruction. We know, for instance, it's nearly impossible to teach reading over a Zoom class to kindergarten and first graders, right? I mean, there are costs associated with us not going back. And so based on what the doctors are telling us with the data, we think the best course of action is try to get as many of our kids back as possible into our schools and putting the protocols that we put out in place so that districts know how to handle potential issues that arise.
We're up to over 50 questions now, Jeff, that we won't be able to get to, but, cost seems to be a theme within them. An additional question, we talked about supplies for the schools, we talked about the students, but we have a question about the buildings. Some buildings are just not in good shape, ventilation systems that are important in this moment and the like. Is there a thought to redirecting some school building assistance type money to those sort of emergency preparedness needs?
So what I would say is the dollars that are given on top of kind of the state allocation, the CARES Act money, the $194 million and the $200 million, those can be used to do some facilities upgrades, and that ties in with our facilities guidance that we put out, where we said you have to follow state and federal guidelines. I would also say that the forced stimulus could be another area where people could find additional money for those. And while the DESE doesn't really oversee the implementation of facility upgrades, that's an MSBA issue. The Mass School Building Authority works with that, but we recognize that the guidance we've put out has been very clear about cleaning and sanitation, about checking your filters, about making sure your systems are operating, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, we keep getting cost-related questions. Staffing and nurses. I read an article where one of the outcomes of the 1918 pandemic was school nurses. money available for additional staffing, additional medical staff that might be needed?
That money is available right now. We are hoping that even more will be available with the fourth stimulus package.
Okay, great. Jeff, I'm going to give you a chance to close out this segment. You've done it throughout your presentation, but you know this, you're dealing with teachers, you're dealing with parents who are thinking about not only their own safety and health, but parents thinking about their children, grandparents thinking about their grandchildren. Make the case. I know you've advocated for it's time to go back to school and the importance of that, but make the case to people learning that this goal or this priority that you've set of in-person learning is the right way to go. I think we share the theme of safety and health for all. We just have different perspectives on what that means.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, what I would say to folks is, we have taken countless hours to work with the medical community to figure out what is appropriate for our students. And the word is clear. 2,000 pediatricians strong say that now is the time to start getting our kids back in school. And so we're really relying on the medical community and taking our signals from them. That's backed up by people like Johns Hopkins, which say we're one of 17 states, I think, that are under the threshold of transmission rates to start going back. But we also have been very clear that we have to put in robust safety protocols. And, we take the safety of our students and teachers incredibly seriously. I'm not just an employee at DESE. I'm not just the commissioner. I also have 2 children in the Boston Public Schools. And I guess what I would say is from everything I've seen and heard from the medical professionals, I will be sending my kids back if the district deems that they're going to do an in-person or a hybrid model. I just think now is the right time. And obviously, if the situation spikes back up, we'll move aggressively to shut the schools back down. But I just don't know how we don't try to do it when all the best medical advice says that we should. I know, we're living in a time these days where not everybody believes in the science and the data, but at the department we do, and we're going to trust the doctors and what they tell us they think is best for our kids.
Commissioner Jeff Riley, thank you so much. I took the time to look at your website. There's a wealth of information on that website about guidance in different categories, transportation and other things. There's also a very nice Q&A feature, and we're up to 68 questions now and I didn't get to them all. So maybe we'll just pass those along to your staff. Maybe they're answered already. Maybe there might be an opportunity to include those, and maybe the superintendents will deal with some of those. Commissioner Riley, thank you for your time, and I am going to move it over to Marta for the next session.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Marta McAllister, and while I work on the Google for Education team, I'm not speaking on behalf of the company today. Really, my participation in this panel is primarily as an engaged Massachusetts resident, a former teacher, and a Boston Chambers participant. I'm excited to moderate this panel today with esteemed education leaders, Dr. Ingrid Tucker, Dr. Patrick Tutwiler, and Dr. Brenda Caselius. And I look forward to what I'm sure we're all hoping will be a glimmer of clarity in an otherwise uncertain and complicated time. So we're going to start with a high-level question that I imagine is on everyone's mind on this call. And it's similar to what we just posed to Commissioner Riley, which is, what will education look like this fall? Each individual city and state is taking a different approach to developing their plan, and all doing so with the safety of students and faculty in mind. But as of today, what do you believe the educational landscape will look like in the coming months for your respective districts and schools? How about we start with Dr. Tutwiler, if that's okay with you?
Totally okay. Glad to be here. I think the easy answer is that it's going to look different. I think whether you are engaged in in-person learning or engaged in remote or hybrid, it doesn't matter. It's going to be different for students. If they're in classrooms and you're doing in-person instruction, the classrooms are not going to have the same furniture that they once had. The desks are going to be arranged in ways that, probably would reflect how desks were arranged in classrooms 50 years ago. And so it's going to be different. And our messaging has really been for families to expect that.
Dr. Casellius or Dr. Tucker, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yes, so thank you for having me, and thank you, Jim, for inviting me to this conversation, and much thanks to everybody for the incredible work that you're doing in terms of supporting your children at home and supporting them in their schooling remotely this past spring. It was quite a lift for all of us to really shift quite quickly into a whole new way of doing school for children. I think, you know, all that Patrick said is true. It will be very different, but I do think that there will be a lot more opportunity for us to focus on the social emotional pieces, which I don't think that he spoke to, but I know that he cares deeply about. You know, some of the physical plant stuff we know is going to look very different in terms of the signage and things on the floor, but the way our teachers and professionals interact with children is going to be much more focused on the health and well-being of our children. We will be taking a greater focus on their care and the management of their care when they return, the connectedness that they have with their peers and to each other, and then building a sense of community in the school. That's going to be a huge piece for us as we think about that. And then, of course, you know, just the way that we teach is going to look very different. In Boston, we're looking at some opportunity to experiment with simultaneous teaching. This is not going over too well with our teachers as we think about it, but that won't be for all day, but it will be some of our thinking. And so we're going to be probably failing at some things as we try to fail forward and try new technologies in the classroom and try new technologies with students, both online and in the hardware aspects of the tools that we give them, as well as teachers really doing a lot more co-teaching, working with their paraprofessionals differently, working with the specialists like art teachers and PE teachers very differently, using outdoor spaces more than we have previously. And then also I hope we'll be able to soon really look at how do we partner with our arboretums or museums or other opportunities to experience Boston, because it is so beautiful and such a wonderful historic city. So trying to get children out of the school and in small groups into other places throughout the city, so and outside. So that's, I think, going to be a little bit of how it might look different, but it will be the creativity of our teachers pulling together with our school leaders and our partners to make that happen.
So I would like to first thank, you know, the Chamber of Commerce and Jim and everyone for pulling this together. And I would agree and echo what my colleagues have said. I think in our situation, we're a smaller school and we don't have, you know, the districts or we don't have the elected officials or unions, but we do have a very involved, parent-involved group that from March has been extremely helpful in helping us look at what would be the perfect paradigm for success in re-entering or reopening the school. And so we have spent, you know, the month, four and a half months or so, just looking at all of the different aspects from the student level, from the faculty level, and from the parents' perspective. And I would agree that it's not going to look the same, but our goal is to create a healthy and safe environment so that when our students come back, that they will be prepared to accept some of the changes that we've put in place. The DESE regulations, we're following all of the regulations as it relates to reopening. I think if we had to categorize, we'd say that the social interaction, which is huge for a lot of students. We are fortunate enough to have 3 buildings, and unfortunately, our enrollment has been impacted by COVID, and so we have the space to be able to do the social distancing, but also the way in which our community communicates and gets together. That's going to be different. We're going to have to do a lot of things virtually, school events that we would have normally had, at least until we feel safe enough to open it up to the community at large. I said our community is very involved. You can't have, you know, parents in the building. So our level of communication will be ramped up, and how we communicate with our parents and our students is ongoing. We are planning to reopen. The way we teach, you know, we're a Montessori school, so a lot of our teaching, our pedagogical approach is, especially with younger children, is using materials. And so being able to prepare materials for parents to, to take home in the event that we go to remote learning, making sure that that their parents are getting information virtually, which is what they've been doing since March. And then finally, just figuring out how we can make adjustments to continue to build community, but also to continue to keep our community safe by adhering to the recommendations and guidelines that we are all familiar with. So it will look different, drop off and pick up, lunch, all of those things will look different, but I do think there's theory in this practice, the preparation for that in communication before parents come on board, and the continuation of that I think will help. And again, it's a plan and we're trying to see if it works, but we won't know until we're in school.
Yeah, I thank you all for those answers. It's definitely a test of all of our creative problem solving on how we address this back to school season. And some of you touched on this in this first question, but I see a lot of questions in the Q&A on some of the specifics of the logistics. So I'm curious to dig into some of the specifics there. Like, for example, how will schools and districts do temperature checks and enforce any mask policies and distancing in the buildings? What, if any, building remodel changes like updating ventilation systems have been happening to prepare? And what is the plan for monitoring? Many of you mentioned this concept of failing forward and trying to learn from what you're implementing, but I'm curious what the plan is for monitoring all these systems and making the decision about how and when to switch course, to potentially maybe go back to remote learning again, for example, if cases increase and we get another wave of the virus. Maybe we can start with Dr. Cassellius on this one.
Well, I think people know quite a bit the condition of our facilities in Boston Public Schools. I think we have over 50% of our schools were built before 1940, and we have about 32 schools that have HVAC systems, so that's causing a lot of stress out in the community. We have been walking our buildings, looking at our current guidance, which is that you will have to have an open window in buildings that do not have HVAC systems. And so we have gone through all of our windows in classrooms to make sure that they're in working order. We have, I think, 22 still left to fix or replace out of all of the classrooms. And then we're going to send principals into our buildings over the next 2 weeks, and they'll start walking their spaces with their faculty and lifting up any areas that still need attention to all of us, so that we can make sure that we do have the proper ventilation according to the CDC guidance. So that's one thing. We've also had to clean our bathrooms and scrub those down. Obviously, that has also been an issue in Boston Public Schools, and we own that, and we are fixing that problem. Heating our water and making sure that we are able to have the right temperatures for the water for hand washing, and supplies, and ordering all of those cleanliness supplies that you need to have on order. So those are some of the preparations that we're taking outside of the social distancing, and classrooms that don't have any windows at all that you just can't use. And so some of those logistical issues are things that we've been fixing.
Dr. Tucker.
Sure. Again, I think my colleagues, I think of them often and know the complexities that they are faced. And I can only imagine what it's been like for them. So I want to acknowledge that, because I think it's easier to, when you're on the outside looking in that particular situation, to say what can happen. So I always want to provide that I am in a smaller environment. We don't have the luxury of having access to the funding, because even though we're a private school, we still are a school that depends completely upon our enrollment. And so we did have capital dollars that were designated that we were able to use from the month of March, working very closely with our cleaning company that has gone through COVID training, that is ensuring that our facilities are up to date. We do have 2 relatively new HVAC systems in our buildings, and 3 of the buildings that we have. But I think a combination of taking recommendations that we've gotten also from 2 task forces that we set in place, which was the Health and Safety Task Force, which is a composition of parents and teachers and specialists in particular areas that could make some recommendations. And obviously it was trying to figure out what would we need to do to make adjustments to our budget. And you can't put a price on safety, but those are that's through my lens, what we've had to look at. And I feel like we're pretty, you know, in terms of all of the things that we've been able to do with the supplies and with the cleaning, the deep cleaning and the continuous cleaning that took place over the last 4.5 months. We've had multiple discussions about what particular air purification we could use. And I always say to people, you know, you never know how you know, what a blessing it is that we can even have those conversations and perhaps be able to make the investment in the right company, but we feel that we're ready just with the steps that we've taken place to prepare all 3 of the buildings, and that we've been able to have some volunteers, people who have volunteered their time, talent, and treasure to help us prepare for the opening. And so that has continued. We're actually releasing our plan, even though we're a private school. We wanted to follow all of the guidelines and the recommendations and expectations for public schools. So we're sharing that with our parents today. That talks about the specifics of what we're going to be doing.
So many of you touched on earlier on some of the social emotional impact for students, and earlier Commissioner Riley was mentioning an increase in rates in suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, abuse. All of these are on the rise, and you know, much of what makes school an enriching experience are more of those social aspects and programming. So I'm curious to hear from this group, and maybe we'll start with Dr. Tucker on this one, but what do you anticipate the future of shared spaces such as playgrounds and computer labs and band and music and sports and extracurriculars that really make school what it is, and how do you think that might have long-term effects on children's social and emotional development?
Well, I can tell you just from when we did our drive-by graduation for our 8th grade students, and just the joy that you saw on students' faces from being able to see one another, even though we were socially distancing and we had masks on. That human connection is absolutely critical to the success we have in schools. Schools are an extension of home. And so it's important as school leaders that we think about, you know, how can we create those opportunities safely for our students? So for us, you know, again, social distancing, we are using the pod or cohort approach in our classrooms. We've been able to do that. And so just the lack of not being able to connect with your peers at recess or in some of the specials that you might have, thinking creatively about how to do that virtually while they're in person. We also have, you know, we've talked and involved our school psychologists quite a bit in terms of the planning. What does it look like? How can we think about ways in which students are down because they've spent the last few months at home or, you know, on a computer? How can we meet their needs? We do have access. We're in Cambridge, but we have access to Danahy Park, which is, I like to say, it's Cambridge's emerald necklace. You know, so we have 50 acres of, you know, of green space that we can use, you know, at our leisure. Now, obviously, there will be other schools now that, you know, there will be some schools that will have in person that are nearby that might not have their own playgrounds. And so making sure that we're in concert and communication with other schools and figuring out that scheduling. So there are so many things that we're thinking about, but the key is trying to create a model that is as similar to what they had, but also being clear about the expectations that it's going to be different, and talking about it with children as young as 21 months, which is what our school ranges from 21 months to 8th grade. So a lot of work around the social emotional, but certainly key for us.
Dr. Tutwiler or Dr. Caselius, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, just quickly, I'll just echo Dr. Tucker's sentiments. This past Saturday, we had our Cross the Stage event for all 4 of our high schools, 9 hours straight of young men and young women crossing the stage to receive their diploma. I was there to hand every one of them that diploma, and children were happy. Their families were happy that they were able to have that event. A huge milestone for those students, and they deserved it. And we were able to provide that. It was different. They all knew that it was going to be different. We only allowed them to attend with 2 people, which, you know, if you know Lynn, they show up in the graduations in big numbers. But they were appreciative and they were happy. And so for me, as a learning experience, that was a clear indication that there is an opportunity here to create some like experiences that will make students feel fulfilled in their experiences related to school. The other thing I would say just quickly is, you know, the social emotional piece is enormous in this, and my colleagues have already talked about this. So we're really taking a tiered approach to this. We know that our students, a number of our students were deeply impacted by the school closures, by the inability to connect with their friends, their family. And so the students who we know have had challenges in that realm, we've been in regular contact with them, with our clinical support team. We've connected families to partner agencies in the city. And then we've provided resources for families who, you know, are expressing concerns around their children just being sad. They don't necessarily need an intervention. They just need some tools, some help. And so I just wanted to underscore that that is a big, big piece of our thinking around reopening, that communication, that partnership, linking families with resources, but then also thinking about experiences that we can create that, you know, students will still enjoy.
Yes.
Many of you are touched on. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dr.
Well,
Caselli.
I'm sorry, I'll be brief. I just, you know, I talked earlier just a little bit about the social emotional learning pieces that we're doing here in Boston Public Schools. But one of the things is just to convene in the morning too, around a morning meeting, and to connect and to receive. And then taking that asset lens that Dr. Tutwiler talked about and Dr. Tucker talked about, where you are not just mitigating learning loss, but you're actually trying to set the expectation that children will thrive in this new environment, not accepting that this is going to be a sterile and sanitized space where everybody's just like robots, you know, so just trying to create the joy that we heard from my colleagues. And I think with that, you know, that means that you have to be even more intentional about art, about music, about dance, about theater. This past year, remote learning, in this past spring, Edison K-8 school did a production on Zoom of Willy Wonka, and it was just beautiful. They did art displays for their visual backgrounds, and then they gave their lines, and they would pop up on and do their lines together. And we had art music classes where they would play their instruments at home, and they would put it together in a compilation in the Zoom. So there's just a lot of really rich resources and learning that teachers are doing. I always say teachers learn best from other teachers. And so I think that they'll be creating and learning and doing some failure too. We'll try things out that just will not work. And then we'll learn from that though as we move forward. But I think taking that asset base, building the structure and routine for children is what's really going to help them. Right now, there's not a lot of structure and routine, and children's mental health and their sense of security and well-being is often built within their routines during their day and the peer-to-peer interaction that they have. And so that's why I think it's so important for children to get back to school as soon as it's safely possible to do so that they have these safe and productive and positive routines in their life.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to underscore, that's actually a good segue. You started talking a bit also about the adults in these children's lives. And I want to acknowledge, including the adults on this panel, we're all struggling with a lot of this emotional and social challenges that come with this coronavirus, which sort of leads me to my next question around teacher support. I know, teachers have had to restructure curriculums that were not originally built to be online, while also adjusting to the health crises and societal crises at large that are happening, also with the pressure of potentially a shortened school year. So I'm curious around, are there shift in expectations in terms of the standards achieved in the year. How, if at all, have you been supporting teachers in navigating this adjustment to school curriculum, especially for some of the more hands-on programs, STEM-based subjects, vocational subjects, etc. And maybe Dr. Tutwiler or Cassellius, we could start with one of you. Tutwiler, you unmuted.
I just spoke for a while, so I'm gonna let my colleagues speak, but I'll come back on though and talk about that in just a moment.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. I have every opportunity possible. I celebrate the teachers of the Lynn Public Schools for making a whole lot out of not a whole lot last spring between March and June. We're a district that prior to March did not have much in terms of devices, didn't have much in terms of infrastructure or know-how relative to virtual learning. But they put stuff together that would make your head spin really, really fast. And so I'm grateful for that. Now we're pivoting to, a much more robust, much more engaging approach to be prepared for any scenario that comes our way. And as you mentioned, that involves looking at instruction completely differently. It involves engaging in really deep assessment of students when we see them in early September to understand where the gaps are in their learning. But I want to be clear, though, we're not talking about remediation. We're talking about acceleration, which is an entirely different thing. And so it's going to be a lot of work. I, for one, am grateful for that 10 days at the beginning of the school year. Typically, Lynn has one day before students return to prepare teachers to engage in the year. And so we're going to take that 10 days and really do some important work.
I would agree with Dr. Tutwiler that we've pretty much had to pivot. I think that the irony is that we had from Friday when we closed school in March to Monday to get our remote learning up and running, right? And so that amount of time and what we were able to do in that short amount of time was pretty remarkable. And there's the acknowledgement that we are, that our teachers are tired and that they do need to be acknowledged and that they do need to be thanked and that they do need to be included in, in decisions that they're going to be impacted by to a certain extent. Ultimately we have to take the information that we have and make the best decision for the districts that you're running or for the schools that you're running. And so we have, there were a number of faculty that opted to have ongoing professional development since we closed in March. Is it ever enough? No, it certainly is not, but I do feel that the teachers are also in a place where they can offer, remote learning or some variation of a hybrid without having the stress that they had in March. So there's that. We also acknowledge that we need to figure out, well, what is it? We typically do have a very Zen approach to the opening of school. Whether it's we're doing some sort of yoga activity, we recognize that it's important for our faculty and staff to have that food for their soul, if you will. And so determining what that looks like and being able to give resources and, our school psychologist has been fabulous at helping us think about those things and mindfulness and what that means as they're coming in. And again, I think everything does stem from being very clear in the communication and transparent. And sometimes, especially these last few months, we see that there are a number of teachers who are, feeling anxious, and we have a responsibility. The same way we want to provide a safe and healthy environment for our students, we want to do the same for our staff. It might look differently at the adult level, but the end result is the same. And so we put in, not just the PD for learning, but also just options for them for emotional, for their emotional well-being that will be continued throughout the year.
I think that for teachers, it's it's just really scary to think about coming back. And I, the other day I was talking about, it's also very different for them coming back. I mean, like Dr. Tucker was saying, for years we've been trying to do more of like a Montessori model, more of a project-based model, and to come back and be socially distanced is just somewhat very disappointing, because teachers are so used to coming back and interacting with their children and hugging their children and being in group time and that sort of thing and being in close proximity. So this will feel very different, and I think there's just this kind of difficult block between trying to see how it could be and what it actually is. And I think once they get in their classrooms and they start practicing and they start working and they start getting through the first 2-3 weeks, I think that then we'll start to see them feel a little bit more comfortable with the reality of the situation that we're in. But I fully acknowledge how hard this is on teachers, and especially the ones who have their own childcare issues and their own family concerns or vulnerable family members at home. So I don't discount that at all. Those are very real and valid concerns that our teachers have. And teachers often are right on the front lines doing all of this work, just like our frontline workers were for COVID response, our nurses, our medical professionals. I mean, and now we're asking our teachers to come into the classrooms and provide education in a very different way than what they're typically used to. So they need the time to be able to practice, and they need all of us administrators to be able to be patient as they do that. So I think that some of the things, then the tools that we'll be doing is giving them additional professional development time, giving them additional time to practice. They'll be using video with flipped classroom. They'll be having new software tools. They'll be children will have their own materials because they can't share materials with one another. We have used BNN as a partner in terms of using broadcast technology, multilingual libraries, so that we're making sure we meet the needs of our EL learners, and just different types of simulations and simulation software that can be used in the vocational setting, and then just small group opportunities when we can do safely in person.
Thank you. And I have 2 more questions of my own, but I've been doing my best to weave in Q&A from the audience as best I can into some of our prepared questions. But I do have one pivot that's related to this question around teacher support. There's a question from the audience around staffing and how even in the best of times, substitute staffing is a challenge. And what are the plans for adequate staffing levels to be maintained when you're anticipating potential staff staying home and being more cautious if they themselves are sick or choosing to work remotely? What are some of your districts and schools' plans?
So we're going to ask our staff if they're going to be able to come back and return. They don't have to tell us. And so we are planning for some overage, expecting that some staff will not be able to come back or will choose not to, or even early retirement. And maybe some staff may choose to retire. So we are accounting for that in our staffing division. We have opportunities for them to take FMLA, or they can take advantage of the Family First Corona Virus Act, or they can, still by policy put in a reasonable accommodation request. So we have those policies already in place, and we'll follow those policies.
I have another question around the term hybrid learning has been brought up a lot, which, from my perspective, begs the question of equity in terms of access to the tools and resources, including things like food services, for example, that will enable all students and staff to be able to function in an environment like this. I know you all are probably aware, but there are many concerns around the potential of coronavirus exacerbating social inequities and widening the achievement gap. What are your thoughts on this, and what are each of your districts and schools doing to ensure that students and staff have access to what they need to be able to function in a teaching and learning model like this, including supporting parents and families that have increased pressure at home?
I could start off, and I'll be brief. So our approach to developing a plan for reopening has really embraced this idea of designing in the margins. And that means thinking about the most historically marginalized or disenfranchised groups first. Students who have learning disabilities, English learners, students of color, economically disadvantaged, not last. And so when we think about this hybrid model, we've prioritized in-person instruction, more in-person instruction for those students, and then additional supports outside of the school day for those students if they wish to take advantage of it. And so well aware of the impact on those groups, particularly during the closure, and we're really prioritizing the in-person approach for those groups in reopening. And then I'd say also, as I'm sure was the case with my colleagues, we started a meal program immediately upon the closure that continues to this day, and we will expand it during the school year, especially for a hybrid model.
Dr. Tucker, it looks like you wanted to chime in.
No, there's not much more I can say. I think Dr. Twyler said it best. Again, we have a different setup in terms of food services, but when we look at the hybrid, it's really not an option for us because most of our parents are working parents. So while we have a hybrid model that's set, we have also looked at the students that are in need the most and have reached out to them based on a survey that we put out, and just knowing our families more intimately, what their needs are, and ensuring that their needs are met during COVID and beyond. So that's pretty much it.
Boston has to do hybrid if we want to do any in-person, because we just can't do all in-person because of the size of our buildings, as well as transportation restraints. The guidance that came from the State Department around transportation was 1 student per bench. And we bus a lot of our children to school, and that therefore, because it would be cost prohibitive to bus all the children, or buy all those buses, it's not possible. So that's why we had to group our students in hybrid for 2 days a week. And then on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they would be remote. And then the opposite is true for the other group of students that week.
Great. So I know this will be our final question because we're running up on time. I did do my best to weave in some of the Q&A from the audience, but if any of you on the panel are able to engage in the Q&A afterwards, I'm sure the audience members would appreciate it. So we know we have many employers and employees from a variety of industries also listening into this call today, and are likely wondering how to move forward to prepare this next generation for the workforce. So maybe in 1 or 2 sentences, what do you believe the future of education will look like? Do you think that one day we're going to go back to what back to school 2019 looked like? Or, it sounds like some of these things have good implications that we might want to stick around for future learning models as well, not just the challenging parts. Do you think we've entered a new phase of education?
So I hope we never go back to what it was, because it was inequitable before. And we certainly weren't meeting the needs of our Black and Brown students, and students with disabilities, and students who are not yet speaking English proficiently. So I'm hoping that over the next 12 months, or maybe even longer, hopefully not, that we are able to find ways to personalize learning for children, to meet their needs exactly where they need them to be met, and to do a better job at educating our children who we have left behind. And so I think that that's the opportunity right in front of us, to see them as the glorious human beings that they are, and to support them as best that we can, whether it's remote or in hybrid, and to do a better job than we did before.
I agree with Dr. Casillas. I think there's no way that you want to look back. I think, one lesson that I learned early in life is that a ship that sails backwards never sees the sunrise. And so, what we were able to do in terms of pivoting and stretching really gives us an opportunity to reimagine what education can and should be. And that's for all children. I believe in, equity and making sure that all students have access to an exceptional education that doesn't necessarily have to take place in a classroom. And so I do think the fact that we've stretched has given us permission to think differently about what it can be and how we can ensure that, that each class of student, regardless of whether they're at a private school or a public school, will thrive in life and have the skills that he or she needs to be successful. And that model of success is something that they would need to determine.
Just quickly, if I may. Now, my colleagues were profound in their response to that. I'll just say, in this field, you never arrive. You're always learning and changing and evolving. We are in the midst of a very challenging period of time. We have learned a lot, and we're bringing that learning to bear on our work with students and families, and there are changes accordingly. And so I would just say that.
I'm glad we could end on a positive note. I agree, and I think it's really motivating that we're not just focusing on the struggles of what's in front of us, but what we can learn and take away to improve. I think that's wonderful. So with that, I'll close out the panel and I'll pass it back to Jim.
Well, thank you, Madam, and great job as our moderator. And once again, thank you to MFS for their continued support and leadership. And thank you to Dr. Caselius, Dr. Tucker, Dr. Tutwiler. A big takeaway of mine is that I could feel through my computer screen here all of your inspirational commitment, empathy, humility in approaching this problem. We're well served by having you as leaders in our school community. And following up on Marta's last point about the future, it does seem like, in this conversation demonstrated, that trends are accelerating in the business community, certainly work from home and applications of technology like Zoom and so forth. But so too, trends that already existed in the education community. You all talked about food, you talked about HVAC, you talked about transportation, you talked about physical and mental health. What schools mean is so much different than it did before. And I think this crisis has accelerated some of those trends, hybrid learning and other, what the role of superintendents and principals and teachers are going forward. And it'd be interesting, I know you're focused on September, but it'd be interesting in maybe the coming months and year to talk more about what that future might look like. So with that, I'll close it out by flagging that the Chamber has a whole schedule of virtual events coming up. You can find more about that on bostonchamber.com. Once again, thank you to all of our guests for a very interesting conversation, and to all of the participants. Have a great rest of the day.